Deltarune is the greatest survey program since Google Forms, and according to its launch trailer, it's a heartfelt journey of humor and friendship. Over the course of the game, a number of characters join your party, and you use them together to fight enemies. But what if you're sick of RPGs about the power of friendship, and want to turn it into a journey of only humor? In this video I'm gonna find out, and try beating Deltarune Chapters 1 through 4 using only Kris. The only real rule is that I need to play through the game using just Kris in every battle. Deltarune has a weird system where defeated party members automatically heal until they're revived, which makes this impossible to do normally, but with the PC version of the game, you can very easily edit your save file with a text editor to modify each character's maximum HP. So I just set every other character's max HP to -1 so they're always defeated. I'm not strictly going for any particular route, but I'll generally try to win battles as a pacifist when possible. Other than that, everything's fair game. So let's get started. The game began with Kris arriving at school and forgetting what a closet looks like. Kris and Susie fell into the dark world, and after making my way to the castle, my first battle was against Ralsei. The solo challenge actually changed the entire dynamic of Chapter 1 right away. Usually Susie spends most of the chapter attacking without your approval, so if you want to win battles as a pacifist, you need to work around that and warn enemies of her attacks. But because she's always down, that entire mechanic is gone and sparing enemies becomes a lot less hectic. Ralsei's battle always ends automatically after a few turns though, so I just defended and dodged attacks until it did. A few rooms later I did the tutorial battle. This was mostly the same as usual, except that the act that lets you hug Ralsei couldn't be used, because Ralsei was downed despite talking to me. Obviously, this was going to be a consistent thing throughout the game. Any acts that require characters besides Kris were entirely off limits. Beyond that, things progressed fairly normally for the first chunk of the game. Because Kris was alone, getting through battles was obviously slower because I had to do everything with them. Since I couldn't coordinate the actions of multiple characters, to spare an enemy I had to act on it one turn, and then wait until the next turn before I could spare it. But the enemies this early on were pretty easy, so it wasn't much of an issue. The first notable battle was against C Round, where normally it's a scripted battle where you try to teach Susie how to act. With Susie and Ralsei both down, this scripted battle won't play out as intended, so no cutscene or dialogue appears, and the enemy won't even attempt to attack. I tried to spare the enemy a few times. In later chapters, each enemy has a mercy meter, and once it's full, you can spare them. But you can raise the mercy meter of many enemies by attempting to spare them when they're not ready yet. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way yet, and attempting to spare it didn't seem to do anything. So I ended up just attacking it to end the battle. For that reason, I also bought the spooky sword from the shop up ahead, since I figured I might be faced with more weird enemies like that Kris couldn't spare going forward. One weird mechanic I'll mention at this point is that other party members can still be targeted with attacks. It's not 100% consistent, it seems more likely in some battles than others, but Susie and Ralsei will sometimes take hits for Kris despite being defeated already, which just dropped their HP even further into the negatives. So I guess that gave me a slight advantage. After pushing forward a bit further and forming a single member fan club, the next notable battle was against K Round. With Kris alone, my only option was to use the bow act to loosen the crown, which meant it took longer than it would using the acts you could normally use as a group. But it wasn't too bad. After getting ditched by a corpse shortly after that, I had to fight Clover. This one was interesting too, because normally you spare it by making it tired and then pacifying it with Ralsei, which I couldn't do. But if you use the manual on it, which Ralsei gives you after the tutorial, it actually becomes spareable normally, which allowed me to do that using Kris. After that, I discovered a strange mechanic. Throughout the game, there are a bunch of sections where some kind of overworld obstacle appears that can damage you if you make contact with it. Normally the game will allow it to damage you down to 1 HP, but won't let it defeat anyone. Because of this, when I accidentally got hit by one, it healed Ralsei to 1 HP despite that being higher than his maximum HP of -1, so I had to go into a battle to get him defeated again. These overworld obstacles are somewhat inconsistent. Sometimes they work like this, and other times they just damage Kris, but I was slightly scared of them in this playthrough just because it was slightly annoying to have to kill Susie and Ralsei off in a battle. A few rooms later I designed the next legendary Pokemon, and then had to fight Susie and Ralsei. This fight was a weird one, and is a good example of the weird mechanic I mentioned earlier. I'm not sure why, but the enemies barely seemed to target Kris at all. I started taking hits on purpose just to test this, and Kris didn't take any damage at all until Ralsei's HP was almost -50. I even reset the game and edited Ralsei's current HP to be 1, then took a hit on purpose so he died, and still he'd often get targeted with the attacks. In any case, to win this battle as a sort of pacifist, I had to use the anything act on Ralsei a few times, but Susie will block the final use of it if she's up, and with Ralsei defeated I couldn't use Sing to put her to sleep. So instead I used the anything act on Ralsei until it was one use away from winning me the battle, beat up Susie until she went down for a moment, and used that opening to use the final act on Ralsei to win the battle. Lancer joined his fan club and celebrated by giving us a club room, and Susie thanked him with attempted murder. This was a pretty funny sequence. Because Susie is defeated already, she doesn't attack Lancer like she's supposed to, despite speaking. But the game also doesn't have a way to do a game over without me actually taking a hit. So as long as I avoid Lancer's attacks, the battle plays out in a mostly normal, albeit funny way. Susie keeps talking as if she's going to kill him despite being keeled over on the ground the entire time. After the first few turns, Lancer starts missing on purpose, so that was basically the end of the battle. With that done, I could start heading for the end of the chapter, but before that I wanted to defeat the secret boss. I'd been making sure to grab the broken keys along the way throughout the chapter, so I got the key fixed and then went to fight Jevil. You can't spare Jevil without Ralsei's pacify spell, so I had no choice but to fight him. This is harder than it sounds. Normally if you choose to attack Jevil, the game expects you to have 3 characters attacking him. With Kris alone, beating him took ages. To win this fight, I grabbed a bunch of Choco Diamonds for healing. They heal Kris for 80 HP, and their current maximum HP was 90, so that was pretty good. In order to win here, I took advantage of a unique mechanic. Kris has an act called Pirouette. The main use of this normally is to tire Jevil out a bit so you can eventually pacify him with Ralsei, but it also has an additional effect when you use it. The game claims that this additional effect is random, but it's actually not. Pirouette has 9 different effects, and they're on a 9-turn loop. So on turn 1 it'll always have the same effect, on turn 2 it'll always have the same effect, and so on, up until turn 10 where it loops back to the effect from turn 1. This was important because turn 2's effect lowers Jevil's defense permanently. So I started the battle by defending with Kris on turn 1 so I'd gain some TP, then used Pirouette on turn 2 to lower Jevil's defense, and then fought normally from there until 9 turns later, where I could use Pirouette again to lower his defense more. The fight doesn't have a huge margin for error though. Most of Jevil's attacks do quite a lot of damage, so while you don't need to do a no-hit run or anything, even a few hits from a single attack can usually knock you out. Sometimes you can get lucky with Susie or Ralsei taking the hits for you, but it certainly wasn't easy, and Kris takes the vast majority of the damage. I usually waited to heal until Kris's HP was below 30, because otherwise I felt like I would be spending too much time healing and I would never finish Jevil off. Since Kris is alone, even though you're lowering Jevil's defense so they can do more damage, the fight still takes a very long time, because there's no way for Kris to match the power of 2 additional party members. So eventually, you'll get to the point where Jevil does his full screen attack, and the fight still won't be over. Jevil will be tired, he'll have the tired sprite every turn, and you could pacify him if Ralsei was alive, but you have to keep on attacking and the fight still has a ways to go yet. It's a very tricky fight, but after trying it for probably longer than the entire rest of the chapter took, I managed to take him down. I grabbed the Shadow Crystal and a weapon that Kris can't even use, and then headed back upstairs to finish the chapter. The rest of the castle wasn't very hard. As usual, the regular encounters took a bit longer since Kris was solo, but they were still easy enough. The K-round refight was a little funny though. It played out basically the same way as the first fight, in that I just bowed with Kris repeatedly, but the dialogue where Susie gets annoyed you're not trying her idea appeared, even though it wasn't an option I could select even if I wanted to. The final boss of the chapter is the king. To win this fight peacefully you just have to survive enough turns, so I just defended and dodged until I won. Ralsei took off his hat, Kris sealed the fountain, and with that I'd completed the first chapter. In Chapter 2, Kris was tired from carrying the party and fell asleep in class. Kris gets upgraded to 120 HP in this chapter. Before I got started with the main content of the chapter, I went to the castle town to see which of the party dojo battles I could do with Kris. These are optional battles for rewards that teach you mechanics or have special conditions. The Jigsaw Joe one was impossible. It's specifically designed to teach you how to use multiple characters at once to spare an enemy in a single turn, so it's completely impossible with Kris alone. I learned about Joe's 69 o'clock shadow and reset the game to escape. The Graze challenge was fine. You just have to graze bullets without getting hit. And the Clover rematch was no problem. Unlike the original battle, where I wouldn't have been able to spare it without the manual, this rematch is a normal fight, where you can use acts to eventually spare it normally. With that done, I headed to the computer lab in town to play 3D Pinball Space Cadet. Inside, Queen kidnapped Noelle and now Kris had to save her. The first few battles here were slow as usual but not very tough. The Werewires, for example, took 3 turns to spare each, but I worked my way forward, playing Punch-Out and progressing without too much issue until the battle against the Sweet Cap and Cakes group. This battle was a bit concerning. You need to get all 3 enemies to dance at once by acting on them, so this battle is the one that introduces the ability to act using Susie and Ralsei, and you're supposed to use all 3 of your characters at once to make all of the enemies dance. If you act on only one of them, they dance for a turn and then snap out of it. So I actually went into the battle assuming it might not be possible. I tried acting on the different enemies to see if there'd maybe be a different effect with a solo character as there sometimes is, but there wasn't. So then I tried attacking to defeat them, but when you drop one of them to 0 HP, they immediately heal back to full. So I decided to try playing the battle as usual, acting with Kris over and over until Susie and Ralsei, despite being dead, briefly got up to dance and learn how to act before promptly collapsing again. And I was happy to discover that once Susie and Ralsei learn how to act, the enemies stop snapping out of their dances, so I spent 3 turns acting on each of them individually with Kris and won. A little further on I encountered Birdly. Normally you can bump Birdly's car with all 3 characters in a single turn to add 18% to the mercy meter, but with a single character you can only bump for 6% each turn, which means you have to bump his car 17 times to win. But it wasn't too noteworthy otherwise. The group fell into a pile of trash, and Susie and Ralsei were so disgusted that they ran off, so I got a brief period where Kris was actually supposed to be solo, and then Noelle joined me. Progressing through this area was actually kind of interesting. For example, Kris had no acts for these enemies at all, but fortunately I could raise their mercy meters by attempting to spare them over and over, like I explained back in Chapter 1. I also stole all of Noelle's gear for Kris. While in this city area, I also got the bounce blade weapon and bought the mannequin from this guy. After fighting my way through a few more slow encounters, I decided to buy a bunch of compact disc bagels for healing, and then reach the next Birdly fight. He claims Kris is no match for him solo, and I actually did do a pretty miserable job dodging attacks, but I eventually won just by healing and acting for long enough. The Spampton fight up ahead is always done with Kris alone, so it was the same as ever, and I soon reached the Queen's mansion. Once I was there, I headed back to the city to buy a bunch of Susie tea. Each flavor of tea heals each party member for a different amount, and Susie tea is the best heal for Kris at 120 HP, which was a full heal for this chapter. You can't buy these after you beat the secret boss of the chapter, and I was planning on doing that next, so I stocked up on 24 of them now, enough to fill the inventory twice, so I could have a full inventory of them for the secret boss and still have extra for other fights after that. There wasn't much point in having more than that, since the tea rots when you start Chapter 3. I headed to Spampton's shop, bought the frayed bow tie, then grabbed the key gen and headed back to the mansion. Before I could access the basement for the secret boss, I had to make it through the first chunk of the mansion. This included the mini-boss fight against Task Manager, which was slow but easy enough. Soon I reached the basement, grabbed the empty disc, loaded Spampton onto the disc, and then headed back to the basement for the fight. Before I started it, I equipped the mannequin and the frayed bow tie on Kris. These are normally pretty weak pieces of equipment, but they increase your defense against Spampton's attacks, which made the fight much easier. And sure enough, this fight was nowhere near as challenging as Jevel's. Unlike Jevel, this boss can be spared with Kris alone, and the game even throws you a bone if you're solo. Normally you can snap wires as a group to add 7% to the mercy meter, or you can snap a wire with a single character to add 2% to the mercy meter. But when only one character is left standing, they'll snap wires desperately to add 4% to the mercy meter alone, making the fight a bit more forgiving than it otherwise would be. All I really had to do to win was just heal Kris if their HP ever fell below 60. It seemed like a good threshold, because most of Spampton's attacks weren't too hard to dodge, and even the ones I did have some trouble with didn't do too much damage with the equipment. So I snapped wires every turn, healed Kris when their HP fell below 60, and that was pretty much all there was to it. I spared him, got the Deal Maker equipment, and then headed back up to take on the rest of the mansion. Believe it or not, the hardest fight in the entire chapter was Rules Card later in the mansion. Winning this fight is optional, but I wanted to retry it until I won. But I tried it 10 times and couldn't do it. To win this fight, you have to claim more houses on this board than he does. With only Kris alive, you can only claim a maximum of 2 houses per turn, as opposed to a normal playthrough, where you can act together with Ralsei to claim up to 4 in a single turn. What made this extra annoying was that you can't save before the fight, so I had to redo all of the sections before it every time I wanted to retry it. However, after losing the fight so many times, on one attempt I noticed that I had enough TP at the start of the battle to claim 2 houses on turn 1, something that hadn't been the case on any other attempt. This actually confused me enough that I reset the game and looked back at my footage to see what had happened, and it turns out that your starting TP in this fight actually depends on how many houses you interact with in the section before it, which is probably the whole reason there isn't a save point just before the fight. This fight is usually so simple that I never even noticed this mechanic before, but it ended up saving me here. I interacted with as many houses as I could before the fight, giving me enough TP to claim 2 houses on the first turn, and from there I was able to claim houses fast enough to box him in and win the fight. With that out of the way, I climbed up to the top of the mansion, recruiting the remaining enemies along the way, and then had to fight Queen. This fight was fairly simple. You need to loosen the wire on Birdly, and you do that by acting on it. So with Kris alone it took quite a while, but Queen's attacks weren't that strong, so I just had to keep at it for a while and I eventually won. After that was the final battle of the chapter, where you're always playing as the Thrash Machine, so it was the same as ever. And funnily enough, usually its portrait is the one you picked, but when you attack it uses Kris's portrait. So I guess on a technicality I could say this counts as a Kris solo since they're the one in control of the machine. In any case, I won the fight and sealed the fountain. The party receives an automatic level up after the battles, so I had to go in and edit Susie and Ralsei's HP back down, but this did mean that Kris got an HP upgrade as well. I headed back to the castle town to take on the new dojo fights. The task manager one was the same as usual. You're just dodging the whole time, so the number of characters you have doesn't change anything. The Chapter 2 All-Stars one was very time consuming though. As I've mentioned before, sparing enemies as Kris alone is slow. This is basically a gauntlet of enemies, so it was the same idea but multiplied. The ambulance was still a slow battle of sparing repeatedly since Kris had no solo acts for it, the wear-wire was a slow process of 12% additions to the mercy meter turn by turn, and so on, but I eventually got through it. And that was the last dojo battle available for this chapter, because the one remaining was the impossible Jigsaw Joe one from earlier. So I headed home, Kris flooded their house with oil, and with that it was time for Chapter 3. After waking up to discover what oil does to a couch, the group ended up on a game show and gave their names. Chapter 3 revolves largely around the video game that you play for rankings. In order to defeat this chapter's secret boss, I had to access an optional area at all points it's available, and you can only get in if you fulfill certain prerequisites during each of these games. There are a few ways to get into the optional area, such as by doing as good or as bad as possible in the games, but if you don't do that, you can also buy access using points earned in the games. So to make sure I wouldn't miss it, I let Susie farm for enough points to buy me access if necessary. Other than that, things progressed mostly like usual. Despite them being knocked out, Susie and Ralsei walk around normally during the games. As with the previous chapters, sparing enemies with Kris was mostly normal but slow, but that presented an additional challenge in this chapter. You get ranked on how well you did after each battle, and one of the things they rank you on is how many turns it took you to win, so my rank in that always depended entirely on how many enemies were in a given battle. Despite doing a miserable job at the chef minigame, I managed to finish the round with an S rank anyway, partially helped by getting a T rank in points from letting Susie farm them. In the green room, I beat Susie at a racing game, entered the secret area and grabbed the Saber 10 weapon for an attack increase, and then played through the first section of the secret game in here, which you need to do every time it's accessible in order to get a piece of armor for the secret boss. Then I headed to the C rank room to flirt with a water cooler, and also drank 9 cups of rotten tea to clean up my storage. I used the points I'd gotten in the first round to buy a bunch of deluxe dinners from the vending machine. These heal for 140 HP, so not quite a full heal for this chapter, but they were the best healing item I could get copies of easily. With that done, I headed back to the game show for round 2. Once again, I farmed a bunch of points so I could get an easy T rank in that category to help push me to an overall S rank. I also tried to get all the bonuses I could. With Kris alone, my battle scores left something to be desired, but there wasn't much I could do about that. Shutta, for example, I got a C rank against, because Kris's only available act solo is Tough Picture, which could be tricky to get the right photo for sometimes and made the battle pretty slow. Thankfully, despite my weak battle rank, I still managed to get an S rank for the round because of the bonuses and my ranks on the other sections. So I headed back to the optional area to play the next stage of the game there, and then fought this guy in the green room to progress the story. This battle wasn't very long, just 4 acts and I could spare him. I grabbed a few more deluxe dinners for storage, and then headed inside for Tenna's final show. This sequence was actually kind of interesting. First, I had to make an exception to the rules and use Susie and Ralsei very briefly. During the show, Tenna starts by giving you a quiz, and I had to refuse to answer that so he'd zap everyone, which healed Susie and Ralsei to 1 HP like the overworld obstacles. That might seem counterintuitive, but this was necessary because in the battles, Tenna replaces every option with the act command, and there are no acts Kris can perform alone. So if you answer the quiz and avoid the damage, you actually get completely soft-locked here. Fortunately, this section is mostly on rails, so it's not like doing this gave me any actual combat advantage. But it was actually an interesting challenge in itself. Tenna will attempt to heal any party member that goes down in the battles, but can't do so because their maximum HP is -1. So I couldn't take a hit in these battles because a single point of damage on Susie or Ralsei meant a softlock. But I managed to do it, and used the off button to escape from the game show. I got Susie and Ralsei defeated again in the next battle I got into, and with that things could proceed as usual. The next section wasn't too different from usual, other than the usual differences like slow battles. The battle against Rules card was kind of interesting in that even though only Kris was alive, the act caused everyone to dance. At the end of the battle, Susie found it so funny that Rules ran away that she came back from the dead just to laugh, before promptly collapsing again. After that, I made it back to the green room, where I played the final section of the secret game to get the Shadow Mantle armor. The stats on this weren't any better than the chainmail. The stats on this weren't any better than the chainmail Kris was already wearing, but it has the effect of protecting against star and dark attacks, which would help against the chapter's secret boss. With that done, it was time for the chapter's main final boss, Tenna. This fight wasn't super difficult, but it was a good showcase of how much slower the battles are with Kris alone. To win this fight, you need to reach a score of 1000 points. Kris only has 2 options for acts solo: saying I love TV, which gives 40 points, or playing a minigame, which costs 44 TP. So basically, I'd spend every turn using the I love TV act, until I'd accumulated enough to play a minigame. The fight wasn't particularly difficult though. Tenna's attacks didn't do much damage, and they generally weren't too hard to dodge, so I eventually racked up the points I needed to win. And for the finale of Chapter 3, I had to face the Knight. If you're familiar with how this fight usually works, you may think that this would be borderline impossible. You can't win this fight by sparing, so you have to attack. One of the strategies that's generally accepted as best is to use Susie's Rude Buster ability to attack, and primarily use Kris and Ralsei to defend to build up TP for Susie, because all of the characters do terrible damage against the Knight with their normal attacks. However, Kris actually gets a dramatic boost to their attack power in this fight if Susie and Ralsei go down. Their damage doesn't quite reach the level of Rude Buster, but it's enough to make the fight feasible. The Shadow Mantle armor I obtained makes it so many of the Knight's attacks don't do too much damage, but a few of the ones that still do a lot of damage were also ones I found trickier to avoid. The one with the swords, for example, I was decent at dodging but not perfect, so I'd sometimes take a few hits when it was used. And the one where the box gets split diagonally I was basically useless at. It was effectively just random whether I got hit or not, and I lost a ton of attempts to this attack alone. So after throwing myself at this fight over and over for a while, eventually I came up with a strategy. At the start of each turn, text appears telling you what attack the Knight is going to use next, so I could reference this to determine whether I should heal or not. For example, even if Kris's HP was low, I didn't heal before the attacks with the stars, because I found them pretty easy to avoid, and they only did 15 damage if I did get hit. But whenever these text boxes appeared, I'd heal every single time without fail, allowing me to go into these attacks with as much HP as possible. I followed this pretty rigidly until the text referencing a migraine. This is a star attack, so it was pretty easy to avoid, but it comes right before the Tempest one where the box is split diagonally, which I sucked at dodging. So what I did was heal when the migraine text appeared, and then dodge that attack as best I could, so that against the next attack I could defend, to cut the damage down and make the attack more survivable. Once you make it to this point, the Knight starts looping through a set of moves until you do enough damage to reach the final phase of the fight. So I continued healing against the migraine and you feel surrounded attacks, and defending against the Tempest. This meant I was using up 2 healing items per loop, and using up one of my turns defending, so I was spending way more time on the defensive. But as long as you're not totally missing your attacks, with the amount of damage Kris deals and the amount of HP the Knight has, you should make it to the end before running out of healing. And once I did reach the Knight's final attack, all I had to do was survive, because once this attack is over, your next attack will always end the fight immediately. Susie tried to claim any portion of credit for the victory and was immediately vaporized in response, and for winning I got the Shadow Crystal and the Black Shard, a weapon that increased Kris's attack by 10, a pretty sizable boost considering their attack was only 20 before that. The Knight called the police on Kris for assaulting them, and with that, Chapter 3 was over.
Whoa, hey guys, welcome to EV Games.
Chapter 4 began with pancakes and a bangin' sermon. Once it was over, I headed for the castle town to try out the party dojo. The only fight available is a rematch against these guys from Chapter 3. The damage could rack up quite quickly towards the end, which could be a bit concerning solo, but it wasn't too different from usual otherwise. The other fight I could do in town was against Mike. This one is kinda funny, because although doing the fight now makes it look like something's unusual, with Susie and Ralsei being down, in a normal playthrough you can do this fight as Kris alone if you do it at the end of the chapter. So this was actually the same as usual too. With that done, I headed to Noelle's house, ruined Kris's chocolate milk, found out that Susie and Noelle have no peripheral vision, and then headed back to the church and entered the Dark World. The enemies early on here were a bit tricky. As usual, Kris being alone meant sparing them took quite a while, and they also did fairly good damage. After working my way through the area and recruiting a few enemies, I met the old man. I made it to his study a few rooms later, which meant I could access his shop. The main thing that was good here were the Scarlixirs, which heal for 160 HP, a mild step up from the 140 HP heal of the deluxe dinners. But I figured the dinners were fine enough for now, so I didn't buy any of the Scarlixirs yet. I puzzled my way through the next few areas, recruiting a few more enemies as I went, and before too long I reached the first mini-boss of the chapter. This one was super easy. The main gimmick of this fight is that you have to navigate through these little mazes, and if you're taking too long then this pumpkin chases you, which makes you think you need to rush. You're also trying to build up TP, so you can use Kris's Unleash act to build up his mercy meter. But the pumpkin doesn't actually show up to chase you until you get the key in each maze, so you can take all the time you want to grab every single TP in each maze before you get it. I did the fight very easily on my first try. To be fair, Susie and Ralsei tanking some of the hits meant I didn't have to heal as much as I otherwise might have had to, but even if they didn't, I'd only have to be slightly more careful with dodging and it would have gone the same way. I got the climbing gear, Susie made a desperate plea to be used in a battle, and I headed back to the study, where I now grabbed a few Scarlixirs. I used the climbing gear to work through the rest of the main story in the first sanctuary. There weren't any issues. There were no bosses left to do, so the worst thing I faced was a regular battle with an enemy I'd recruited already. But once I opened the way to the next sanctuary, I wanted to take care of some optional stuff. I traveled around the sanctuary to collect parts of a song, needed to access the chapter's secret boss. Obtaining one of the parts required me to fight the Holy Water Cooler and Miss Mizzle mini-boss. It wasn't much more difficult than a regular Water Cooler or Mizzle enemy, since it attacked in a very similar way to those enemies, and gets spared in a similar way too. The other parts of the song didn't require any boss fights, so I played the completed song to open the study's fireplace, and entered the secret boss room. And this was the first secret boss that I wasn't going to beat. This chapter's secret boss is a 1v1 between Susie and the old man, so like with the Lancer battle back in chapter 1, Susie started the battle dead, but it still worked until I took a hit, which actually kills her and causes a game over, which can't normally happen in this fight. So technically I probably could beat this fight if I did a perfect no-hit run, but since it's a totally optional fight for Susie, I think it kind of falls outside the bounds of a Kris solo run. I gave it a few tries for fun though, just to mess with it and see how it works. You can attack with Susie, but it doesn't seem to actually attempt to deal any damage, since the miss text doesn't appear when it gets dodged. Rude Buster doesn't do anything at all, neither does OK Heal, so I left this fight alone. Before I left the sanctuary, I finally got rid of the deluxe dinners, and bought a bunch of Scarlixirs to fill my inventory and storage for the next section of the chapter. So after climbing my way up to the exit, I sealed the fountain, defeated the secret boss after all, and then caused property damage to enter the second sanctuary. The early sections of this area weren't very difficult. As usual, battles were slow, but I reached the study fairly quickly. Past the study, I had to do a mandatory solo Susie fight against the old man. Normally she's alone for a few turns, and then Kris appears. But when I entered the battle, after blocking the initial wave of attacks, the game just soft-locked. It never progressed past the initial attack. Fortunately, if Susie goes down in this battle, the phase where Kris appears starts instantly, so I reset the game and took a hit on purpose to make that happen. This seemed to work okay, and Susie got healed back to 1 HP for this next phase, so I took hits until she went down again, which once again soft-locked the game. Unlike other fights, where Susie would just do whatever she needed to while defeated, this particular fight really doesn't seem to like it when she's down, so I had to make an exception to the rules here, and allow Susie to survive this fight. This fight is basically just scripted anyway though, all I had to do was defend every turn, and it was over pretty soon. Other than that fight, I finished the area without too much issue, and then hopped over to the third and final sanctuary. This area was pretty quick and easy, so I reached the final boss area before too long. And after taking a few swords to the face, it was time for the end of the chapter. The knight retaliated for me embarrassing them last chapter by summoning a titan, and after climbing it I had to fight some spawn. You can instantly defeat both of these enemies with the Banish Act from Kris at 64 TP, so I defended every turn and dodged attacks to build it up, and won the battle without too much issue. And after one more climb, it was time for the final boss of the chapter, the Titan. This fight is a bit weird. It's actually not very difficult at all. Most of its attacks are of the dark element, so with the Shadow Mantle from chapter 3 equipped, most of its attacks were weakened, and with the Black Shard weapon from the Knight, Kris can deal a sizable amount of damage even when the boss's barrier is up, because it's an enemy of the dark element, and the Black Shard has the additional effect of dealing increased damage to dark enemies. So I didn't even have to bother using Kris's Unleash Act to open it up to increase damage. Kris dealt plenty of damage already. The problem is that once you get the boss's HP low enough, the final phase begins, where the boss heals itself up, and the old man appears to help you. The way this is supposed to work is that you've basically won at this point. The old man revives everyone every turn, and you gain new acts to end the fight almost immediately. But with Susie down, the fight actually isn't winnable. In this phase, if you want to, you can hack away with Kris turn after turn, to slowly whittle the boss's HP back down, but once its HP drops to 40%, it'll instantly heal itself back up to 90%, and do so every time you damage it back down to 40%. So you cannot do this fight with just Kris. But since I'd basically beaten it, since this point in the fight is where it ends in a normal playthrough using special acts, I decided that I'd just redo it with Susie. Once I got back to the part where the old man appears, Susie's acts ended the fight, and with that the challenge was completed. Susie destroyed some stained glass, Kris revealed hyper mode to the local grocery store clerk, and chapter 4 came to a close. And with that, the adventure was over. You can indeed beat Deltarune Chapters 1 through 4 using only Kris, for the most part. This was actually pretty fun. It usually wasn't terribly difficult, but Kris being alone put a unique twist on many different parts of the gameplay, like changing the dynamic of Chapter 1 entirely, or causing funny oddities to happen. And in the game's harder fights, Kris being solo definitely brought the challenge up and made the margin of error a lot smaller. I thought it was pretty fun, so if you want to try this yourself and are wondering how to set it up, in the pinned comment I'll be providing an explanation on how to edit the party's maximum HP like I did. I hope you enjoyed, and thanks for watching.